All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going deep, really deep into the Cold War and how it tangled up with decolonization around the world. We've got this pretty hefty historical document as our guide.
Definitely a dense one.
But don't worry, we'll bring it to life, pull out the good stuff.
It's a period where, well, everything's changing, empires falling apart, superpowers on the rise, and in the middle of it all, you have all these people, all these countries fighting for independence.
Right, and it's not just the big picture stuff. Like, did you know there was this moment right before things got super icy between the US and the Soviets, where their soldiers, they actually met, celebrated together on this bombed-out bridge in Germany?
The Torgau handshake, yeah. It's almost surreal when you think about what came after, decades of tension and mistrust.
Talk about a shift in mood. So to get a handle on all that, we got to go back, way back. What were the seeds of this whole Cold War thing? What set it all off?
Well, you can't talk about the Cold War without the Russian Revolution, right?
Yeah.
Early 20th century, Tsar falls, you have Lenin, the Bolsheviks, then Stalin comes along and tightens his grip on power. The world was watching, and not everyone was thrilled about it.
Yeah, I bet the West was a little freaked out by this whole communist thing taking root, especially with Stalin calling the shots.
Definitely. The U.S., especially, they were already suspicious of communism. And Stalin, his style, the rapid industrialization, the forced collectivization, total political control, it didn't help.
No kidding. And then there's the fact that the Soviets were left out of the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. That probably didn't help build trust either.
Yeah, that was a missed opportunity, for sure. And then you have things like the U.S. supporting the White Russians who were trying to topple the Bolsheviks. All these little things added up, widening the gap.
Right. So this mistrust is brewing, but then World War II happens, and suddenly these rivals, they're on the same side fighting the Nazis.
A strange alliance, born out of necessity more than anything else.
But I imagine things were still pretty tense behind the scenes. Did anyone really believe they could work together once the war was over?
Deep down, they knew their goals were completely different. They had totally different visions for the world after the war. And as soon as it ended, boom, those tensions exploded back to the surface.
So the stage is set for the Cold War, but was there a specific moment, like a turning point, where the U.S. really decided, okay, the Soviets are the enemy?
Well, there's this one event in 1946, the Long Telegram. It wasn't just any telegram, though. It was this massive 8,000-word analysis of Soviet behavior, written by George Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow.
8,000 words, that's like a book. What was so important about it?
Kennan, he argued that the Soviets were expansionist by nature. Their ideology, he said, it viewed capitalism as an existential threat, something to be destroyed. Yeah. He believed they'd exploit any weakness they could find to spread communism.
So it was a warning, basically, a call to action for the U.S.
Absolutely, and it had a huge impact. Kennan's analysis, it shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades. It led to the policy of containment, the idea of stopping communism from spreading without directly fighting the Soviets.
Trying to box them in without starting World War III, how did that play out in the real world?
Well, it had a lot of consequences. U.S. involvement in Korea, Vietnam, all sorts of conflicts around the world were driven by this containment idea.
Yeah.
It also led to the creation of NATO and other alliances designed to counter Soviet military power.
So this one telegram really kicked off the whole Cold War chess match.
In a lot of ways, yeah. And you got to remember the context, too. This is all happening while Europe's still in ruins from the war, empires are collapsing, decolonization is gaining steam.
The world's in total chaos, and on top of it all, you have this superpower rivalry heating up. So how did the Cold War and decolonization, how did those two forces collide?
Both the U.S. and the USSR saw these newly independent nations as, like, prizes to be won. They were offering aid, military support, even running propaganda campaigns to try and win them over.
So it wasn't just about stopping communism, it was about shaping the future of these countries.
Exactly. The Cold War, it got tangled up in everything. Alliances, political systems, you name it. And it often made existing tensions in these countries even worse.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster. Did this competition ever turn into actual fighting between the superpowers?
There were a bunch of proxy wars, yeah, where they'd support opposite sides in a conflict. But one of the most dramatic examples in Europe was the division of Germany and the Berlin Wall.
Ah, the Berlin Wall. So how did Europe, a continent that had just been devastated by war, become the center stage for the Cold War?
Well, after the war ended, the Soviet Union was occupying huge chunks of Eastern Europe. Stalin, he wanted a buffer zone to protect the USSR, so he installed communist regimes in these countries.
So while the U.S. is pushing democracy and free elections, the Soviets are imposing their own system.
It was a stark contrast, a line drawn right through the heart of Europe.
And that line became very real in 1961 with the Berlin Wall, a concrete barrier that divided the city, families, everything.
The Berlin Wall, it became a powerful symbol of the Cold War, the human cost of this ideological battle.
It's hard to believe a wall could represent so much for so long. But this fight wasn't just in Europe, right? The Cold War had its fingers in everything, from Asia to Africa to Latin America.
You're absolutely right. And to really grasp how big this was, we got to look at how it played out in those regions, how it shaped decolonization, and how we're still dealing with the fallout today.
So we talked about Europe, but the Cold War also had a huge impact on decolonization movements, especially in Africa. What were some of the big events, the key players in Africa's fight for independence?
Well, it was a messy process, that's for sure. And the Cold War, it definitely threw gasoline on the fire. Both the U.S. and the USSR saw opportunities in these newly independent countries, often ending up on opposite sides of conflicts.
So more proxy wars, basically. Were there specific countries where this competition played out?
Oh yeah, take the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, for example. Rebellion against British rule went on for almost a decade. The Mau Mau fighters, mostly from the Kikuyu tribe, they were determined to get their land back, kick out the British.
Our source mentions how some of them would even take British Scout uniforms and use them as part of their resistance. Pretty clever way to turn the tables on the colonizers.
It shows how resourceful they were. But the conflict was brutal. The British cracked down hard, lots of casualties on both sides.
Yeah, the fight for independence was rarely peaceful. Were there similar struggles in other parts of Africa?
Absolutely. The Rhodesian Bush War is another one. White minority government in Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe today, they were fighting to stay in control against black nationalist movements.
So it's a fight against colonialism and racial inequality. How did the Cold War get mixed up in all that?
The USSR and China, they both supported the black nationalist guerrillas. They saw it as a way to weaken the West's grip on the region. The West, on the other hand, they were officially against the white minority rule, but didn't want to get directly involved. They were afraid of things escalating, I guess.
It seems like the Cold War often made these decolonization struggles even more complicated, turning local conflicts into global ones.
That's a good point. It made finding peaceful solutions a lot harder.
We've talked about Kenya, Rhodesia. What about North Africa? Was the fight for independence there affected by the Cold War too?
Definitely. The Algerian War for Independence was one of the most brutal conflicts in the region. It lasted 8 years. Hundreds of thousands of people died.
Our source mentions a woman named Jamila Bouhired, who became a symbol of the Algerian resistance. What's her story?
It's an incredible story. She went from small acts of defiance as a student to joining the armed struggle against the French. She was captured, sentenced to death by the French. International pressure eventually got her sentence reduced to life in prison, though...
Wow. To face a death sentence so young just for fighting for your country's freedom? Her story really puts a human face on the struggle for independence.
Yeah, and it also highlights how important women were in these liberation movements. They were often right there on the front lines, fighting, organizing, keeping the resistance going.
So we've seen how the Cold War impacted decolonization in Africa, but it also had a big influence in Asia. The Korean War, for example, is often called the first hot war of the Cold War. Why was it such a turning point?
Well, it was a classic proxy war. The U.S. backed South Korea, the USSR and China backed North Korea. Brutal conflict, millions of people died, and it ended up dividing Korea, which is still divided today.
It also showed the U.S. was serious about containing communism, even if it meant risking a bigger war. Did that same dynamic play out in other parts of Asia?
The Vietnam War is probably the best-known example of the Cold War's impact on Asia. It was a long, drawn-out conflict, deeply divided American society, and it had lasting consequences for the whole region.
Yeah, Vietnam is often seen as a loss for the U.S., a war they couldn't win, even with all their military power. Why was that?
Lots of reasons. The U.S. underestimated how determined the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were. They were fighting on their own turf, had support from a lot of the locals. The U.S. relied too much on air power and firepower, which ended up killing a lot of civilians and turning people against them.
So having a powerful military doesn't guarantee victory, especially when you're fighting against people who know the land and have the support of the people. Vietnam was a tough lesson for the U.S., both in terms of lives lost and the damage it did to public trust.
Definitely. and it left Vietnam devastated and divided for years. The effects of that war are still felt today in both Vietnam and the U.S.
So the Cold War touched conflicts in Africa and Asia, but it also had a big impact closer to home. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, almost led to a nuclear war. Can you tell us about that? How did it all unfold?
The Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a tense standoff back in 1962. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, they were on the brink of war for 13 days over Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. It was the closest the world has ever come to a full-blown nuclear war.
I can't even imagine how scary that must have been. What caused the crisis? What set it off?
Well, the U.S. had tried to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba before, with the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a total disaster. And the U.S. also had nuclear missiles in Turkey at the time. So the Soviets, they thought the U.S. might try to invade Cuba again.
So putting missiles in Cuba was their way of preventing that and also matching U.S. nuclear power.
Exactly. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, he was taking a big gamble, and it almost blew up in everyone's faces. The U.S. found out about the missiles, they sent spy planes, and then they blockaded Cuba, demanding the missiles be removed.
Sounds like a high-stakes game of chicken. How did they manage to avoid a war?
It took a lot of tense negotiations and back-and-forth diplomacy. Kennedy and Khrushchev, they finally worked out a deal. The Soviets agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba, and the U.S. secretly agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey and promised not to invade Cuba.
That was a close call. It's a reminder of how easily things could have gone wrong during the Cold War.
It really shows how fragile peace can be in a world with nuclear weapons. It also changed how the U.S. and the Soviet Union dealt with each other. They set up a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow so they could talk more easily and avoid these kinds of misunderstandings in the future.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a lesson for us today, a reminder of how dangerous superpower rivalry can be.
And how important it is to talk to each other and not overreact when things get tense, especially with nuclear weapons involved. It's a lesson that's still relevant today, with all the new challenges to global security and the spread of nuclear weapons.
So we've seen the Cold War play out in Europe, Africa, Asia, even in Cuba. But what happened next? Did these tensions just go on forever?
Well, things were changing behind the scenes. Remember that rivalry between China and the USSR, the Sino-Soviet split?
Yeah.
That created an opening for the U.S.
It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. The Nixon administration saw a chance to, maybe pull China away from the Soviets. Plus, by the early 70s, the U.S. really needed a way out of Vietnam, and they thought China might be able to help.
Interesting. So you have this global power shift happening even while the Cold War is supposed to be at its peak.
Things are always changing in geopolitics. Nixon's visit to China in '72 was a huge deal. Remember, the U.S. hadn't officially recognized the People's Republic of China since 1949.
It's amazing how fast things can change when countries have shared interests, even when their ideologies are totally different.
Pragmatism usually wins out in the end. Both the U.S. and China got something out of it. The U.S. got a new ally against the Soviets, and China wanted economic and political partners as they were coming out of their own internal struggles.
So the U.S.-China relationship was changing. But what was going on inside the Soviet Union at this time? Were there any signs of change there?
Things were brewing, but not a lot of people saw it coming. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, and he was different from any Soviet leader before him. He knew the USSR had serious problems. The economy was a mess, the war in Afghanistan was draining them, and people were desperate for more freedom.
Gorbachev is often seen as the guy who ended the Cold War, right? What did he actually do? Did he plan for all this to happen, or did it just kind of get away from him?
Historians are still arguing about that. Gorbachev started two big reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika, to try and revive the Soviet system. Glasnost meant openness. It encouraged transparency in the government and more freedom of speech.
So basically loosening up the strict control and censorship that the Soviets were known for, that's a pretty radical move for a communist regime.
It was. And then there was Perestroika, which meant restructuring. Gorbachev wanted to reform the economy, bring in some market ideas, and give more control to local governments.
So he's walking this tightrope, trying to fix the system without completely breaking it. Did he maybe underestimate how powerful these changes would be?
It's a good question. Glasnost gave people a voice, but it also allowed nationalistic and anti-communist feelings to come out. And Perestroika, while it had good intentions, it couldn't really overcome the problems with the Soviet economy.
So you have these internal pressures and economic troubles building up. Was there a moment where it all just tipped over, where it became clear the Soviet Empire was going to fall?
Most people point to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 as that moment. It was people power, inspired by Gorbachev's reforms and what was happening in other Eastern European countries, that brought down that symbol of division.
It must have felt like the whole world was changing right before their eyes.
It was a huge moment, and it set off a chain reaction. Communist governments across Eastern Europe started collapsing, one after another, and mostly without violence.
So it wasn't a military victory for the West, but people rising up and demanding freedom and democracy that ended the Cold War?
Exactly. And then, in 1991, the unimaginable happened. The Soviet Union itself dissolved, broke up into 15 independent countries. The Cold War, which had dominated global politics for almost 50 years, was officially over.
What an ending. Was there a sense of celebration everywhere? Did everyone welcome this new world order?
Most of the world was happy to see communism fall. But there was one big exception: China. What happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989 showed that not all communist regimes were ready to change.
Right, the Tiananmen Square massacre, where the Chinese government crushed pro-democracy protests, was the opposite of what was happening in Eastern Europe.
It showed that China was determined to hold on to its authoritarian system, even as the Soviet Empire crumbled. They chose repression, silencing anyone who disagreed, and tightening their grip on power.
So as one chapter ends, another begins. The Cold War may be over, but the story of China's rise and its relationship with the West is still being written.
It's a story with its own twists and turns. China's economic power has exploded, but they're still authoritarian. And Tiananmen Square reminds us that freedom and dissent are still very limited in China.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the beginning of the Cold War to its dramatic end and how it affected decolonization and changed the world. It's been quite a journey, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We've talked about some incredible people, seen moments of hope and despair, and explored ideas that still matter today.
If there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's that the Cold War wasn't just about politics and ideologies. It was about real people, their lives, their struggles, and what they hoped for. And the impact of that era is still felt today.
The world is still dealing with the legacy of the Cold War, from the rise of new global powers to the threat of nuclear weapons and political instability.
So as you go about your day, think about the stories we've shared, the connections we've made, and the questions we've raised. The Cold War might be over, but its history is still alive in big ways and small ways.
And maybe this deep dive has inspired you to learn more about this fascinating and complex period. There's always more to discover, more to uncover, more connections to make.
That's what we're all about. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.